Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Tuesday, 31st of March. We have a number of you still dialing in. Thanks for everyone for taking time. This really important process. A number of you have asked questions in the last 2 days that you're seeking some clarification on. So we're grateful to have Minister Moss here with us this morning. We also have Michael Bridge, Chairman of Tourism NT. We have Michael Scott, Chairman of Tourism Top End. We have Acting CEO of Department of Tourism, Sport and Culture, Andrew Hopper. We have Alex Bruce, CEO of Hospitality NT. And online, we have Dale McIver, CEO of Tourism Central Australia. Good morning, Dale. I'd like to thank all of our fellow associations today. This is a terrific process. Has been the feedback by combining our memberships in order to be able to create a good platform for those experts that we want to hear from, so as not to stretch their resources. So thank you very much to Tourism Central Australia. Thank you to Hospitality NT. Thank you to Litchfield Tourism Group. Thank you to Catherine Tourism Group, East Arnhem Land Tourism Association, and of course to Tourism Top End. So without further ado, I will now ask the Minister, Moss, to give us some opening comments. She's also been terrific in taking some of those questions on notice that we've supplied yesterday from a lot of you that we'll be able to work through, and then we will, as we go through this session this morning, move around the room. We are all, while it may not look that on the screen, we are all respecting our 1 and 4 coverage here. So if it looks a bit sparse or the camera angle looks we're a bit close, I assure you we are got that proper separation in place. So without further ado, Mr. Moss, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to join you all again this morning, and hello wherever you are across the territory. It's you know, things have been still moving rapidly, I think, in terms of some of those changes. So today is a good opportunity to talk to you about some of the changes that have come into place over the last couple of days, and try and answer as many of those questions that have been submitted as possible. But obviously probably the most pressing one has been, in recent days, the Chief Minister has talked about stricter border control measures. So that does mean that after midnight on Wednesday, anybody who's entering from interstate will be directed into forced quarantine. That's accommodation that is secured and monitored by the government. And from Friday, that forced quarantine, those accommodation arrangements will need to be paid for by the individual that is travelling. So that's probably the biggest change that we've had since the last time we all came together. But there's also been some national dialogue about changing the gathering limit to 2 people from 10. And there's been some questions about that as well. So just to make that really clear, in the territory, we are also advising people that the limit to gatherings is 2. And there's been some questions around enforcement. Obviously, at present, police are right across a whole range of different functions to do with the COVID-19 response and their normal functions across the community as well. So you will have seen them in bottle shops. I know in Alice that's been the case for quite some time, but supermarkets and a whole range of other functions across the community. So we're encouraging people to do the right thing around those 2 people gatherings. And obviously we will continue to monitor that situation and make any changes that we need to accordingly. But we remain in a very different position than lots of other states and territories do. There is a lot more cases that you can see in other states and territories, and we have done what we can do within tightening that those border controls up to make sure that we protect the territory from the same, basically. So you might see over coming days different states and territories doing different things. They may well be, you know, enacting stricter rules sooner than us, but that will be to do with the circumstances happening in their jurisdictions that are not necessarily happening here. Around remote communities, I think it's really important to just also make that clear that remote communities are covered under the Biosecurity Act now, so they are closed to all non-essential travel. There's been a number of questions about how that relates to places like Borroloola or Jabiru, for example. They're all captured under that Biosecurity Act and closed for non-essential travel. So that's something that was put in place, I think about a week ago, by Ken Wyatt, and the Northern Territory government through Andy Cowan's team have been on the forefront of working with land councils and some of that work that's happening in remote communities now across the country. Some other important things that have come out over the last probably 24 hours or so. Obviously, the JobKeeper payment has been announced by the federal government. It's a $130 billion pot of money, which is around 6 million workers receiving a fortnightly payment of $1,500 a fortnight through their employer if they're eligible. So we will make sure that information gets sent out to people as well, but I think that will be hugely welcomed by the sector and by the business sector more broadly, as well as the understanding that there is that conversation happening around rental relief and rental evictions as well. So again, it's acknowledged as a really pressing issue for the business community and for the community more broadly. I understand there's still a bit of work in that, but it's been acknowledged as an issue that needs a solution and that people need some relief on. So there's a 6-month moratorium on rental evictions. There'll be more details to come around that in coming days. So Glenn,
Yes.
Would you like me to run through some of these questions now, or shall we pass around to some other people around the table first?
Maybe we might throw it around and we come back to those questions if that's okay with yourself.
Great. So I might hand over to Michael Bridge.
Yeah, thank you, Minister, and good morning, everyone. I mean, from a broader perspective, there's probably not a great deal that I can update you from what I said last week. Certainly the intra-territory travel has further been restricted, and the travel advice now obviously will preclude any serious intra-territory travel. Other than that, our outlook on domestic and international remains pretty much unchanged. The Tourism Board is now meeting weekly to go through that, and will disseminate any information of use to industry through the RTOs as it comes to hand. The main thing I want to talk about this morning is the $50 million small business support package, which was announced, it seems like a lifetime ago, but it was actually only 8 days ago, approved by Cabinet on the Monday morning, and conditions and eligibility sent out last Friday. Just touching on that, when we started that process last Monday afternoon, there was 391 businesses that were potentially eligible. By the time Friday morning came around, there was over 1,000. We had 3 significant changes to that during the week. However, the fundamentals on what the Chief Minister had given to that group looking at that really hadn't changed, and we explained that briefly last week, and that's survival initially, then adapt, and then the recovery phase. Under the survival part, the immediate funds, it was made quite clear to us that this money needed to get out the door quickly, and therefore time was of the essence. As I said, those applications opened Friday night. We've got a team in DTBI that have been looking at that all weekend, and money is due to start flowing this week. That first stage, that survival part of the package, was split into 2. The first one predominantly was designed around to an extent, and we're not saying to the full extent by any stretch of the imagination, but to satisfy businesses' creditors. So they were lump sum payments that will be paid out this week to eligible businesses that will go in part to satisfy creditors. That's whether it's landlords or power or workers' entitlements or payroll, whatever the case might be. The second phase of that, which we were pretty close to nailing towards the end of the week, was an ongoing weekly payment that would be more associated with people's number of employees, whether total number or FTE. Now, the brakes was put on that late last week because we had an idea that the feds would be coming up with something, as they did and announced yesterday, and we didn't want our territory businesses to not get their fare of the Fed stimulus program, or the support program, I should say. And so we're back at the table this morning working out how best to place that second tranche. We expect that will be ongoing payments, weekly payments based on size of business, etc. But by what metrics, we're not exactly sure. The second part, the adapt part of that $50 million support package, has also been released on Friday afternoon. There's initially a $5 million amount that's been set aside, $1,000 for sole traders, up to $5,000 for small and medium businesses. And this is for any business that needs to adapt to the new norm. So whether this is home delivery services, whether this is taking your business online, whether this is infrastructure to, move equipment or whatever around. Again, I was just about to use the example of gyms getting outside and doing it on the Esplanade, etc. And unfortunately, that was one thing that changed last week as well. But anything that will help your business adapt to that new norm is available. And then we have a pot of money at the end for the recovery. We're not going to set our mind exactly to recovery for another week or two. There's other higher priorities that are out there. And I guess the biggest, or the pressing question that I've been asked in the last week, as we've added from 391 to over 1,000 businesses, is the quantum of the fund. The Chief Minister has publicly stated and has certainly given direction to us that if we get this right, there are additional funds to boost to that $50 million if the need arises. So he's certainly in here for the long term, and that's our mission. So our initial goal is to get as much out the door to affected businesses as possible. So that's probably, actually the only other thing I'd say is this is unprecedented, to try and get this amount of money through a cabinet decision and released on the Friday for paying the following week. The feds haven't been able to do it, with all due respect, and therefore we are trying to plug the gap before you guys can access some of those more significant federal funding initiatives. And so that's what the design has been. By no stretch of the imagination do we think we've got it right. We know there's pockets of people that might have missed out. Some might be consciously, some might be absolutely unconsciously. So I would welcome everybody, if they think they have been drastically affected, specifically by the announcements of last week and the Prime Minister's announcement on the 22nd of March, that haven't been covered, please go through DTVI, please put your application grant in, and I know they're considering each and every one, and they'll then provide feedback if appropriate, if you're not in fact eligible. So that's about it from me. I'm happy to take any questions throughout or at the end on specific, or as always offline and during the week, which many people have taken the opportunity to do, and I thank everyone for their support in that regard. So, thanks very much.
Did you have a couple of quick words?
Yeah, just very quickly, before we get into questions and answers. Many of you, I would hope, have received calls from the team at Tourism NT who are supporting the broader Department of Trade, Business and Innovation process of touching base with every business operator in the Territory. If you haven't yet, rest assured the call will come, but equally we will circulate again in our next industry update relevant contact details, so that if you do have a pressing question around tourism in your business, by all means you can give us a call. The team are working hard to get to everyone as quickly as they can, but as you'd appreciate, there's a number of you, so it's just taking us a little bit of time. But we are keen to talk to everyone and be available to talk to everyone and offer any advice we can particularly around what the different programs are and how you might be able to access them if you've got some queries. There's also a range of other hotlines, and again, we'll highlight those for you so that you know who you can talk to if you feel you've got a very specific question about one of the existing programs.
Okay.
Would you like me to start addressing some of these?
I might just throw quickly to Dale, and then we'll come
No
back.
worries.
I know that a minister has some questions here as well. Dale, we might go into Q&A now, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks, Rob, your questions, we can see that. Yvonne, we can see your questions. And I'll at this point have to acknowledge to everyone where it might be addressing that to us personally. They are on the screen here. But I think we're very comfortable, and these are very valid questions. So there are some questions. We do have questions which people submitted before. Dale, you've got one of those questions that members have been asking to yourself down the centre. I'll hand it to you. Unmute, Dale. Unmute. Yeah.
You're on mute. Oh, hang on.
I think we're
1 second.
competing there.
That's
There we
all
go.
right. Little technical glitch, but good morning, everyone. Good morning, Minister. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming together and taking the time again. I think, it looks like we've got about 118 online at the moment. So fantastic that industry is welcoming this. We came up with a few questions that our members have specifically been asking. Probably 2 of those have sort of resolved and had some answers in the last 24 hours that related to concerns over the border crossing and the fact we were still getting a lot of travellers still moving around and not really adhering to those border controls. But thank you to the government for listening to that and bringing in those tighter border controls. The other one was a clarification for employers for the need to stand down staff. But I think, again, with the job payments last night announced by the federal government, I think that will probably answer some questions for industry there. So probably one question that we're getting asked from our members, obviously because we cover quite a region, I imagine this is probably the same for the top end as well, is can we please clarify the essential inter-territory travel? For example, can residents from Tennant Creek travel to Alice Springs for essential needs and return to Tennant Creek without the need to self-quarantine?
Okay, Minister, are you okay for that question?
Well, yes, it will still depend on exactly what that travel is for. But we're very happy, Dale, if you want to put us in touch with the people asking those questions so that we can talk through those individual circumstances. There's obviously a whole range of things that, like, it might be medical appointments, for example, that would be absolutely considered essential. But let me just get some more clarification for you around the Tennant Creek Alice travel. Andrew, I don't know if you've got any more. But things like medical appointments and all of those sorts of things we accept people need to do travel for, and there will be provisions in place for that.
Yeah, and I think the key message that's come from government and health is that, and the Chief Minister, of course, is that travel should be limited as a starting position. However, as the Minister quite rightly pointed out, the need to travel between places like Tennant Creek and Alice Springs is available without the need for self-quarantine. But first and foremost, the position should be limited travel, and that's been woven through the messaging as we start implementing all these different elements. So I think. But again, Dale, happy to take that as a specific query in relation to a particular example if you've got it.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to take that offline. And yeah, it was, specifically around a medical, those sort of things. So I think everyone is very clear on the non-essential travel. And one other one, and it might be sort of a bit of a joint thing for all of us to take on board, but is there going to be a tourism industry template for a COVID-19 management plan? And there may be some things already being worked on, but that was a really good suggestion I heard a couple of days ago.
So Dale, there isn't a template developed yet in terms of COVID-19 management plan for tourism, but certainly the Chamber of Commerce are offering free advice and expert advisors. So even if you're not a member. So that might be a source for people to go to. At the moment, we haven't developed one, and it isn't in our planning, but certainly the Chamber of Commerce are available.
Okay. I heard in that, Dale, one of the questions, which is about intra-territory travel. Minister, yesterday we received questions which related to Aboriginal communities and some of those places that are key for us in tourism, but also have a very high Aboriginal population. I'll throw that one to yourself and the question that certainly that we've asked there.
Yeah, so there was a couple of questions which were about permits in remote locations and Borroloola specifically. But as mentioned previously, remote communities are prescribed under the Biosecurity Act, and an exemption can be sought from the Chief Medical Officer. That's the only way in which you can get approval to travel in and out of these communities. There is information on that exemption process, because I'm sure there are some of you probably on the line who would be interested in having a look at that eligibility criteria. So we can send the link out through Glenn, through Dale, and through others around that. But all of those remote locations will be covered under that Biosecurity Act. And that's been the case from quite early on in the piece.
Some other ones you'd like to move through the questions?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I might just work through some of the questions that have been submitted prior to today, but I'll try and do it in a sort of overarching way, because I know that some of these questions are relevant to many of you. So the first one, which Alex alluded to previously, was around wayside inns and wayside inns, caravan parks kind of along the highway, and what this means for them. So people arriving in the Territory will not be able to stay overnight in a caravan park or a roadside inn of their choice. Obviously, they will have forced quarantine arrangements. They will be going into accommodation where that is supervised and monitored by government. But if you were driving from Alice Springs to Darwin to return home, you've done your 14 days forced quarantine, you are permitted to stay overnight in a venue of your choice, including those roadside inns and caravan parks. So I know this isn't an exact science, and many of you are doing different things as well. You've got many different arms to your businesses. So again, if there are individual circumstances you have, we'll make sure you've got the hotline numbers, or that you get to talk to someone in tourism or the appropriate place in government to talk through that. Accepting bookings for leisure stays. Again, I think it's been very clear from the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister that people are being encouraged to stay home unless there is an essential reason for you not to. So that is the current message to Territorians. That will continue to be the message to Territorians and to Australians in the short term, is not to be going out for non-essential travel or stays. Is there the likelihood that there'll be tighter controls? If so, what would happen to hotels? The advice that we have presently is that hotels can remain open if they're providing accommodation to people, including those undertaking quarantine. And I know a number of different hotels and accommodation providers are providing specific packages around that. That is the current advice. Is there the possibility that there will be tighter restrictions? I think it's fair to say yes. We'll continue to monitor the situation though. So I couldn't tell you right now, yes, next week there will be tighter controls. We're monitoring the situation, and we're doing what we need to do based on the medical advice. So hopefully with the controls that we have in place now, we can make sure that we are slowing that spread of coronavirus around the country. We can make sure that we are avoiding community transmission in the Territory, and we can avoid having to go to some of those stricter controls. But obviously, it is a possibility, and I need to be quite upfront about that. Microbreweries as tourism, completely agree. Our hospitality sector, our microbreweries, our other food and beverage experiences are absolutely critical to our tourism industry, but also to the vibrancy of where we live. And when, they're getting us through now, and when everything does recover and we come out of the other side of this, you know, we need you all there. So absolutely critical, and can be applying for that $50 million Small Business Survival Fund. So one of the things that we made quite clear through that survival fund is that hospitality, tourism, we recognise that these two sectors are two of the biggest sectors that were impacted really early by some of those decisions around mass gatherings, around travel restrictions, and are a priority for us within that fund. In terms of when people can reopen, whether it be up to individuals to decide, again, we will make sure that we continue to let the sector know as changes are made. As those border control measures start to pull back, which inevitably they will be, and that will be, we will all rejoice on that day, and I look forward to coming together with you then. But when they do come back, we will be putting out that medical advice again, and it will be up to individual businesses when things are returning back to normal around when you reopen, in line with that advice. But again, you won't be on your own. The department, all of your RTOs will be there to help you and to guide you through that at that time. One of the questions that came through was whether there'll be any tourism after things settle down. And I think this is probably something that both Bridgie and Andrew might want to talk to as well. I think one of the things that we do know is that after other shocks to the sector, and you think about things like SARS, for example, or there are a couple of examples here in the Territory, there is pent-up demand. We know from research that has been conducted across the country that, you know, even 3 weeks ago, there were people who have delayed their holidays, but they, you know, they're still planning to travel when they can. They're just delaying their travel, or there isn't necessarily everybody just deciding to cancel and not consider that travel again. They do want to travel, and there often is that pent-up demand that gets released essentially once things do start to return back to normal. But on that one, I might just hand over to Andrew or Bridgie if they want to make a comment about that.
Yeah, Minister, I might just start with a broader picture, and then Hops will talk more specifically. But, you know, as I said last week, we're really, you know, struggling to get hold of any sort of information that will guide us into the future. We think international is going to be challenged for some time. We think domestic will have some limitations placed upon it for all the reasons I went through last week. However, we still believe that there's opportunity for that domestic travel, particularly our prime market being that grey nomads, the over 55s travelling, etc. But where we think the biggest opportunity is in the short term is intra-territory travel. For the last quarter, it represented 31% of our total visitor economy spend. The national average is just over 60%, so all other jurisdictions are much better supported by their intrastate or intra-territory. The Barossa is supported by Adelaide, the Margaret River is supported by Perth, etc. We're going to start delving, a bit like Tourism Australia's delved into the domestic market. We're going to delve into the intra-territory market. We're going to help our two RTOs in that regard and distribute marketing funding appropriately so that we can stimulate that. If we can double to the national average, 30 to 60%, that completely replaces from a dollar perspective, the international loss. Now, if you were talking to the Treasury boffins, they'd tell you that the intra-territory money is not worth as much as international money and the like, and we take that on board. But the first and initial stimulus that we hope to put out will be based on intra-territory. We believe that intra-territory will be allowed to start, will be opened up sooner than interstate, and certainly sooner than international, and so that's where our initial concentration is. Might hand over to you, mate, if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I think that probably just taking that one step further, just to reassure people, I know one of the questions was, what are we doing? And I think there was some lovely commentary recently about what are the tourism staff doing. I can tell what they're doing. They're working really hard to understand what we can press go on and what's going to be effective straight away when all of this changes. And we have to look to the horizon and be positive about it changing, albeit times are very difficult right now. So the team are doing a mountain of work to understand which markets and which elements within each market we can turn on. And Michael talked to the grey nomads a minute ago. We've obviously got the millennials. And there's a whole range of different cohorts within each of our different markets. Each of them are probably going to respond differently. So the work that we're doing right now is to refine very clearly where we're going to focus when, to make sure that we can turn those different segments back on quickly. Certainly intra will move first, domestic then international. In terms of what the curve might look like, I think if you look at the previous SARS example, it was a V, a very sharp uplift. It's fair to say that what we're dealing with here is nothing like SARS in terms of the impacts, both on simple things like people using their leave now, so they won't have leave, which will be a challenge. Equally, people not being able to reasonably have a full wage or have lost wages. So again, their discretionary spend will be reduced. We believe it'll look more like a U-curve. The challenge that we're working through right now is how wide is the base of that U-curve. We'll be doing everything we can to make sure we create as sharp a climb as possible, as quickly as possible. But I think it's not unreasonable to say, both domestically and internationally, it will be challenging to move things quickly. But I can assure you that everything we're planning right now is to make sure whatever we can move, we can do as quickly as possible when the opportunity presents.
And could I just add, and not delving into too much detail, but just to give you some sort of appreciation of the data that we're seeing is, there's some quite positive messaging about forward airline loads 12 months in advance, and people sort of preempting to say, people are starting to book. But we're sitting there looking at that thinking, well, what's happened is people can't travel next month, and therefore they've put off their flight for 12 months' time because they can't get a refund, but they can get a credit for future use. So how much of that travel? I mean, airlines around the world are reporting that they've got record forward bookings. But that's really just because next month has been delayed 12 months, and you usually don't book your airfare 12 months in advance. So a lot of the information that's coming, which normally we would just take on board and see as a positive or negative, we've actually got to analyse. Otherwise, we'll be making incorrect decisions.
Thanks, Michael. On the chat, I'll just throw a couple of questions on the chat. There's a couple of really good ones there, and they're questions that have been consistent through the offices. I know we're all getting it. One of those is around NT Parks. So a lot of our tour operators pay a significant cost they've got is the leasing of their vehicles, the insurance of their vehicles, their staffing, but one of those is park permits, NT Parks. So I might throw that to Andrew to give us an update of where you're at on that. And I feel that if there was an answer, that answer would already be amongst us. But what are your thoughts on where we're going on that, mate? I know that John Hart from Wilk Darwin's asked that there. I know that Rob has also asked that question a couple of times.
Yeah, look, and it's a very fair question. The team have been working on that now. The challenge we've just got to work through is so the answer is yes, that's what we want to do. But there's a range of stakeholders that we need to talk to. Some of our permits relate to joint managed parks. Some of them are very much in our control because they're on parks that we have independent control over. So just bear with us. It's certainly something that the team are working on. We're just working through the full quantum of it, and then we've got to talk with the different partners to make sure that the rationale, the reasoning, and the financial impacts are all understood and accepted and mitigated where possible. So it'll just take us a little bit of time, but I can assure you we are looking to address that.
Michael, there was a question that was on there before with this first announcement around the 50 million, and there's been quite a bit of feedback over the weekend from members, and we've got a couple of questions up here that relate to businesses that weren't in that process ramping up because we were in our wet season. And so they didn't necessarily have the staff on board. They weren't operating at their capacity. Rob's asked a terrific question there, and it's one that him and I've heard this from others, which is in relation to the questions that he's got as a business, as a sole owner, but he was looking to employ a few people. He didn't necessarily fall into those categories.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I've just noted, so Robert's question about the sole traders, obviously there was that $2,000 payment, which, as I say, should be forthcoming this week. You are absolutely at the forefront of the next stage, and that's the stage 1B, if you like, that was going to be based on an FTE type a number of employees. However, we pulled that late last week with the Fed's impending announcement. It is the absolute intention to continue to distribute in some way. And at this stage, unless something's happened in the last 30 minutes I've been here, that there will be ongoing weekly payments that will be across that broad range of businesses, including sole traders. And that's to take care of things, as you've mentioned there, the other creditors that you might have to satisfy along the way. Yvonne's question about the number of employees. As I said, it's not necessarily perfect. However, we've got this out in record time. I fought quite hard. I've got Alex here with me. He'll testify this. I fought really hard to get this first payment revenue based because it's based upon satisfying your creditors. I wanted people to submit their BAS and us give a percentage of the BAS back there. It was made quite clear to us by the people within DTBI that they couldn't process that amount of information fairly and in a time frame that got money out the door this week. And therefore, the quickest and easiest way to check was number of employees. The important thing to remember, whilst most hospitality and tourism businesses have less employees or FTEs this time of year, that's across the board generally. And so it's still a fair measure just trying to put one business up against another as far as the quantum is concerned. The quantum was meant to be revenue based. However, we took it back to a much easier mechanism so that funds could be distributed quickly. Again, if you think you've been particularly disadvantaged through that mechanism, I would put that through on your application form. There's going to be some latitude, and that's probably too open a statement because we're trying to be guided by normal procurement and grant principles within a government framework, but doing stuff that's so quick and outside a normal government process that it's really being challenged. But the obvious ones, and there have been a couple, I have assurances at all levels that we will be addressing those. So hang in there.
Can I just pop to a top one there? Matt Barsby's in from Nhulunbuy. He's asked a couple of questions there at the top, which are possibly questions that we need to defer to the CMO on, Chief Medical Officer.
I've actually made a note to myself, get somebody in touch with Matt to talk about Nhulunbuy.
So, okay, Matt.
Yeah.
So we'll follow up with you, Matt. And for those who have those equal quarantine questions, we'll make sure that they are passed through to the right speaker there. Alex, Hospitality NT.
Yep, g'day. Hello everyone, thanks for the opportunity. Just a couple of things I did want to reiterate or raise for those present here so that we're all aware of the issues that are coming forward. More information down the track on travel, both for those interstate trips of locals and people that are in the territory that are in their caravans moving around. We've got the unfortunate situation where our proprietor out at Timber Creek can't go to Katherine to get supplies anymore without getting a 14-day restriction. Can't go across the border to Kununurra and is essentially landlocked. We appreciate the sensitivities of the remote areas and the remote communities, but we're just wondering, that's getting pretty restrictive in terms of being able to go to what is her local Woolies and do her regular supplies. So we hope over time, when things can be case by case relaxed or proper precautions on a health matrix can still be considered, we're going to cause real problems if we keep people locked in their own businesses, completely isolated for too long. Liquor restrictions are another thing that's come along our way this week, and that's just in terms of an additional process for all of those businesses that don't have a pally on their front door. Just in terms of the shop stewards in our bottle shops have to interrogate the customers about where their planned drinking intentions are going to be a bit more, and have been given a stronger power to refuse service. Industry is complying with that. Yeah, we're working with Licensing NT. It is a reasonable and best endeavours kind of approach, because some of the valid forms of BDR, like the a proof of age card and the OCA card, don't have a residential address on them. So we're working to comply, but we wouldn't want to see too much of a tough stick approach taken at this stage, especially because we've got a lot of people in our bottle shops that aren't traditionally in those business units, as all the other parts of the unit business have been stood down, and that's the one bit that's operating. And there is some growing concern that as the takeaway proper is getting further and further restricted, appropriately, if that's the view of the government, we're seeing a liberalisation of people that didn't have takeaway without BDR, putting stuff on social media about going to the waterfront or going to your local park. They're putting photos that may not constitute social distancing, although a family unit's probably ineligible. So we've just got to be careful that with all of these restrictions, it's hurting everyone, and then it needs to be equity as much as possible achieved across the different categories. Pick up a comment that I saw there, which we've got quite common on as well, is the visa holders. So unfortunately yesterday, if you're a Kiwi, you're in, but if you're anyone else, like a Nepalese chef, you're not eligible for the federal payments at this stage. And that's got ramifications for tourism and hospitality businesses in how quickly we can gear back up on the other side of this. So we are working with the federal government on that. It's a slow moving beast though, and it's case by case, country by country, linked to their bilateral relationships that underpin it all. So we don't expect any quick answer on that. The small business fund, the one that flared up for us particularly on the weekend, was we appreciate it's a small business relief or survival fund. So the 10 million turnover generally, but to back out accommodation entirely, which is what's on the website at the moment. So there's a lot of small business accommodation directly and indirectly affected by the decisions taken last week. We will be raising that with the committee that's still looking at how this system needs to continually evolve. The thing I needed to stress for just our metro accommodation guys on the line this morning is I had to hose down the ABC. They thought everyone was going to have a boon because of all these new restrictions of forcing people into hotels, and wanted to get me on the radio and say how great it would be for you all. So managed to hopefully kind of tone that down and correct the record when they saw quotes of, $2,500 for the full cost of security plus food plus accommodation as, oh, this is a real win for your members. We're dealing with, unfortunately, accommodation providers that are still making the decision about whether to keep their doors open or not, and, occupancy's falling off a cliff as everyone's being told not to come and not to go out. So we appreciate that. So we just, as much as government can reinforce that this is not a boom time for accommodation sector in Darwin, that would be appreciated. And that's me.
Okay. And I just thank you, Alex. Is there anything in that you would like to respond to?
I think all very valid points. I just wanted to touch on the visa holders as well, because we've been talking to many businesses as well, and certainly hearing that. So we are also working to clarify information around visa holders, and there has been a whole range of work done federally. But, I'm hearing from you guys, particularly around workers who can't necessarily meet their requirements and what does it mean for them, and acknowledge that, in hospitality and tourism, these people are like family to you and have, worked in your businesses for a very long time. So we'll continue to work with the federal government as well around, flexibility with those requirements, access to the many packages that are available. So there is a section on the Department of Trade, Business and Innovation fact sheet for businesses that is specifically around visa holders and what's currently in place around those different visas, in terms of some flexibility. And I just noted this part here that says, in relation to temporary sponsored employees, so it might be on 457s or 482s, the decision to cancel visas is discretionary. The Department of Home Affairs may exercise some lenience in situations where temporary visa holders have lost jobs due to the COVID-19 crisis. So, look, I think we're all in the same boat here. We acknowledge that there are issues around visa holders not meeting their requirements, and everybody wants to make sure that the right thing is being done by them as much as possible as well, and by you guys who provide those jobs. So I did just want to touch on that.
Andrew, there's some questions in there regarding remote access. I might throw to Andrew to answer a couple of those questions that have popped up on there, or you've got another comment you'd like to add?
No. Yeah, happy to. And it touches on Alex's question too around Timber Creek, that example. So there's been a significant update to the page, and just for everyone's information, we'll send out an EDM later today addressing all of these Q&As and with relevant links, so that you don't feel like you've got to try and keep track of it all. We'll share it all later today. But there's been a significant update to the approved remote essential workers process on the coronavirus website. So it talks there about what are considered essential activities and eligibility. So it's got everything there from healthcare, education, right the way through to delivering food, fuel, mail, medical supplies. So now there is a process you have to go through though to get that exemption. So that's all documented there, and I appreciate it's a process that you've got to go through. So it's going to take some time, but please rest assured it's not looking to limit the practical needs, and that Timber Creek one's a really good example. It's not looking to limit people or get them landlocked. The exemptions need to be worked through, and it's all about making sure ultimately that the Biosecurity Act is implemented in the best way possible for the safety of the people that it's trying to look after. So we'll shift that through, and that'll help, I think, maybe just articulate what's included and considered in there.
I think that relates to Charlene, your question. Charlene's down in Mataranka, in terms of access what the restrictions are. We saw Amy on there, I think, before in regard to Glen Helen, and in terms of transport, there's some sort of related questions in amongst all that there as well.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we'll try and articulate is areas that fall outside the Biosecurity Act as well. There are some exclusions, so we'll also try and make that a little bit more explicit. So I think one of the examples might have been at Tillmouth, I think. So that I'm pretty sure falls outside the exemption zone. So anyway, let me just clarify all that later today in our material for everyone.
Thanks. Michael Scott, was there any comments or questions that you had that you'd like to ask on behalf of Tourism Top End and fellow board?
Thanks, Glenn. Obviously, there's quite a lot of questions coming through the group chat section, and I noticed that people like Suzanne Morgan are actually answering some of these questions for us. But with the amount of information that's coming through, I'm just wondering now whether or not we can rationalise the direction of some of these steps, because an example yesterday, the JobKeeper initiative was put forward, and it clearly stated that was something that was going to be handled through the ATO website. When I went onto the ATO website and typed in JobKeeper registration, it asked me if I wanted to apply for a job with the ATO. So some of these things that might seem, well, you just go here. I actually didn't. No, I think you need to be able to count to do that.
Give you a breath of fresh air in there.
Yeah. But I think if we could get something rational with regards to some of these schemes now, and just comb through them, because there are now so many, it's becoming quite confusing. And I know there's people asking questions here, where do we go for that? So I don't know if that's something that is dealt with from a government. And I'm not just talking about tourism here. I wear a few hats, but obviously, a lot of these sites are overwhelmed. You simply can't get on, and so then that sort of begs the question: Am I looking in the right direction for this? But I think now just a wrap up of all of these schemes, and just like Suzanne has done there, a good heads up as to where you go for this information and help.
We're shortly approaching time, so what I might do is gather your thoughts for some final comments. We'll have to keep an eye on these questions here. I'll just say that the NT government, and especially yourself, Minister Moss, has been extremely accessible and supportive through these times, and thank you very much for the time and the commitment that you give working with our industry. We're extremely grateful for it. And the NT government has been terrific in terms of addressing this, I think, as Michael said, very, very swiftly, understanding these are mammoth decisions that need to be made. And also it's one thing to make the decision, but it's another one to implement that. I feel that in the Territory we have, and the overwhelming feedback from all of our members, felt that what we get from the federal government is largely announcements that we pick up through the ABC and then an announcement on an email. I'd like to let everyone know that on the weekend, in a joint email from Hospitality NT, Tourism Central Australia and Tourism Top End, we have reached out to our 4 elected, Senator McMahon, Senator McCarthy, Snowden and Gosling, and said this is above politics, guys. We need more information from the feds. We're not getting that. We don't have federal bureaucrats on the ground up here. So Senator McMahon has come back to us yesterday seeking some clarification, seeking to use this forum. And Luke Gosling has also come back and said whatever it takes to get more action from Canberra, recognised and put into a Territory context in an NT tone, which is really important, which is the big missing piece here. So we'll keep chasing that one. And thank you.
Do you want me to smash out a couple of quick questions? I've got 3 that were...
Mr. Bridge, I'd love you to. Thank you.
Okay. Re the Department, Lorenzo's question. My understanding, and it's only through friends of mine in the hotel sector, that the Department of Health issued an EOI about a month or so ago to see accommodation houses that were interested in becoming quarantine. Don't take that as gospel. That's what I've been told. You might want to contact Department of Health. Natalie's question, re-event organisers, PCOs and the like. I should know, I don't, but my understanding is absolutely. I believe you're included in about version 3, about last Wednesday, into that $50 million fund. So please make application. You're one of the affected parts of the tourism industry, and I believe you will be a part of that. Robert's question about controlled excursions, absolutely fantastic idea, and that's the sort of adaptation that we're looking for. I'm not sure of the messaging, and it might not go forth based on the overall messaging that we want people to stay at home, etc. But fantastic. We can get some sort of controlled excursions going, particularly on the mental health front. I think that's a great idea. I'll take that on board, and I'll come back through the RTOs with that. I'll talk to the chief in his office and just see whether that's something that they might contemplate, and if not now, at what point in the future.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Hopper, is there anything here that you feel that we've missed you'd like to pick up on?
No, the one that just came back up again was around, from Dale, I think, around wayside inns. So just to be really crystal clear, from midnight Wednesday, all people entering the Territory will be required to spend that 14 days in forced quarantine. And when they arrive at an NT border, they will be directed to the establishment that they need to go to. It won't be a choice. And that establishment's been selected across a range of criteria, which I'm not aware of in detail, but they will be directed at the border. So in theory, if they're moving through the Territory, and we talked about this earlier about people returning home who haven't had to quarantine, they can still stop at a wayside inn or caravan park. But in terms of people coming across the border, they will be directed to where they need to go. And of course, from Friday, that just escalates further in terms of them being directed and them paying for where they need to go. So, and there's been a lot of work done. There's a lot of operational requirements around the locations selected, everything from other independent facilities to how can they be secured depending on the level of quarantine. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, one more quickly. There was a question from Mataranka. Sorry, I didn't catch the name, and it was about the liquor restrictions. It's not correct to say you can only buy or access in your town. It's just a check process that the attendant in the bottle shop needs to ask. If you're not from that region, as loosely as that is defined, and we're working with licensing for some of the curlier parts of the network for what their region is, the bottle shop attendee must ask you where you're drinking or planning on taking your alcohol. If you satisfy that, you can still purchase. So with the Mataranka example, if you've got a caravaner coming through or a Darwinite that's on his way returning back or heading back up after doing some work down that way, they can still buy in your town.
Andrew, how does business become a quarantine accommodation provider option? Or is that a full list?
So there was a expression of interest process run. I must admit, I lost a little bit of track of time, maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago, where that was considered. I think everyone also probably needs to appreciate that there are a number of businesses that have put their hand up and have been put on the list, but right now it's driven by demand, and there simply isn't thousands and thousands of people needing to be quarantined. So to Alex's point earlier,
we got 16 at the Darwin Airport Macua location that were the international cohort. We're talking handfuls at a time here.
Yeah, and so unfortunately, I think probably quite expectantly, people thought it would be thousands of people. It's simply not, and so even the people that are already on the list are not necessarily seeing any people arriving at their establishment. And again, with the numbers being small, they need to be put somewhere where they can be managed effectively and efficiently. So that means that right now, if those numbers and the demand stays low, they're more likely to use fewer facilities where they can better contain them and manage them through.
I think it's also interesting that people that aren't necessarily being controlled to self-isolate, as in the people that are coming from the borders, there may well be people out there that decide to, for whatever reason, self-isolate anyway. And obviously, I think it was in the paper yesterday that some local businesses are actually providing self-isolation packages for 14 days, if that's what you want to do. So there's another take on self-isolation.
There is a
maybe you don't like your own house or something.
Yeah, there is a business opportunity out there if there's mining and gas that's crossing the borders. So there's a bit of a landlocked employee base here. They're not subject to any of the quarantining rules of the government, but they're bunkering down in some of the accommodation around the traps. People that were travelling into Southeast Asia as part of their business model are taking, longer term bookings in some of these places, but that's all just case by case.
I might just go for last comments, and Dale, I might just get you ready on the line. Michael Bridge.
Just answering Yvonne's question, things have changed so much in the last 24 hours. We were hoping to have that second trench of the survival announced yesterday. We had a meeting today. Alex has just told me it's just been put off till tomorrow after last night. I would expect every Friday, and particularly this Friday, there'll be another announcement as far as that next survival weekly type thing. It might come out tomorrow, but we'll see how we go. But we'll continue to try and keep that information flowing, and we're acutely conscious that the cash is required right now. So hopefully this week you'll get your cash, the initial payment, and next week you'll be available to access the next one.
That's good news. So stay tuned on that one. Dale, Alice, have you got?
Yeah, look, just thanks everyone, and probably just more a comment. If we can just make sure those stricter border control details are just being distributed to the wayside inns, so that when we do get travellers stopping, that they've got that factual information sitting in front of them as well, because we know that we're probably still going to get some travellers that'll probably be pretty determined. So if we could just get that info distributed to all those wayside inns before tomorrow, that would be much appreciated. And thanks everyone, keep up the great work.
Great. And last comments I'll throw to Minister Moss. Thank you very much.
Just a thank you to all of you. It's good to get those questions through as well in real time, so we know what information might not necessarily be getting out there as well. Thank you, Suzanne, who's been putting up some of the links in that comments box as well. But yes, we can absolutely get the visa information link out to all of you. Amy, Matthew, Barty, I think the three of you had some questions that hadn't necessarily been answered specifically, but we will make sure we get onto you as well to talk about some of those specific issues or circumstances that you're facing currently. But look, thank you. And I'm open to coming back, you know, in the next few days or whenever we decide to do this again. I think it's been very useful for everyone, and certainly useful for me. I'm on my way to Cabinet after this, so this is always a good way for me to know what I need to be feeding through to my colleagues as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Michael Bridge. Thank you, Andrew Hopper, Michael Scott, Alex from Hospitality NT, and Dale McIver. This is really valuable to all the members. We've had over 120 online this morning. We would like you to come back. We've set up this forum so that we can, like we said before, we can all be together across associations, across retail, across hospitality and across tourism. Thank you very much for that. For everyone who has supplied a question, this is all captured. We will be seeking to get this back out to you and posting this available online. Plus the people who, when you're registering, you also got to put in those questions. We'll seek to get as much as that answered and posted online. Thank you, and we look forward to having you back again very shortly.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, guys. Good luck.